This will be the second of two lectures on the work of Jane Austen. Last time, we considered the sociological aspects of Austen's work, noting her interest in upward and downward mobility, as well as her desire to shore up the authority of the ruling class. This time, we'll explore the psychological aspects of her fiction. As many critics have noted over the years, Austen develops new ways of showing us what her characters are thinking and feeling. Indeed, she makes a major innovation in narrative technique, and in the process may help to reshape our understanding of human consciousness. Before we consider those achievements, we should take up the matter of Austen's literary reputation. The first thing we need to know is that Austen's earliest admirers were other writers, including her most distinguished contemporary, Sir Walter Scott. Scott wrote a very flattering notice of Emma, and she was very proud of that notice. By the time of Austen's death in 1817, she had achieved a modest sort of fame, but was not regarded as a major figure. Her reputation through much of the 19th century was indeed that of a cult writer, a writer's writer, whose fans included George Eliot and Henry James. These writers admired Austen's masterly use of dialogue and her handling of dramatic scenes, and they were right to do so. The scenes in earlier novels had often been longer and more shapeless than the ones in Austen. Austen's skill as a dramatist is one reason why her novels have so often been adapted for the screen, as much of the dialogue for the movies can be taken straight out of the books. The first chapter of Pride and Prejudice would be a perfect example of what I'm trying to say here. You could film the scene between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet right now. Just get two good actors and have them go to work on those speeches. Now, Austen's admirers also viewed her as a master of narrative construction, gifted with an impeccable sense of how to shape and structure a story. It's not enough to be able to come up with a few good scenes. You have to know how to put them together. You have to be able to create a larger structure out of those smaller pieces. Now, among the earlier novelists, Austen's only rival as a maker of plots is Henry Fielding. Both Fielding and Austen share a delight in symmetry, balance, and order, and this is one of the reasons why Austen is sometimes compared with Mozart. The symmetry of Fielding's Tom Jones is obvious. This long novel is divided into 18 books. 6 of those books are set in the country, at and around Paradise Hall, where Tom grows up. The next 6 take place on the road, after Tom is expelled from Paradise, and the final 6 are set in London, where he nearly meets his doom. At the very end, as you'll recall, everything comes out just fine. He marries the beautiful and wealthy girl next door and resolves the mystery of his birth, discovering that he's descended from the local gentry. Like Fielding, Austen also arranges her events carefully. At the exact midpoint of Pride and Prejudice, and I mean in the very center of the book, as we've noticed, she places Mr. Darcy's first proposal to Lizzie Bennet. In Fielding, however, the author's management of events sometimes calls attention to itself, not least because the narrator is such an important presence in the novel. In Austen, such arrangements are never distractive or intrusive. When reading Austen, even though we always know that we're dealing with a work of art, the impression or effect of realism is never spoiled. It is important that we acknowledge Austen's technical brilliance, her complete mastery of the novelist's craft. And I'll just say that if you're an aspiring writer, you could do worse than to take Austen as your model. Just go out and get a copy of Pride and Prejudice or Emma and outline the chapters, write down the major events in each one, looking to see where and how she introduces new characters or deepens, heightens central conflicts. Once you've figured out the shape or structure of the story, steal it. Try to borrow or adapt it for a story of your own. Anyway, even more important than Austen's skill as a maker of scenes and stories is her innovative exploration and representation of human psychology. In considering this achievement, let's turn our attention to Emma, a work published in 1815, since that novel centers on the process of psychological development. The opening paragraphs of Emma are among the most famous in all of literature, and they provide a basis for everything that happens in later chapters of the novel. Here's how Austen's narrator begins. Emma Woodhouse, the character's name, the first two words in the book. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. A single sentence. This sort of writing appears effortless, I know, but Austen actually chooses and arranges these words with great care. The opening phrases are significant. We're told, first of all, that Emma is handsome, clever, and rich. And if we examine those words in order, we can see that each one has a specific connotation. It's interesting to see that Emma is described as handsome, not pretty or beautiful, but handsome. And that word handsome makes her seem stately, maybe even a little imposing. She's supposed to be a substantial figure. It's also important that Emma is clever, not brilliant or learned. We're supposed to see her as quick-witted and perceptive, but not in any way bookish. Finally, it's very important that she's rich. This, we feel, is the icing on the proverbial cake. Emma seems to have it all. Good looks, brains, and now she's even got money. And as the paragraph goes on, we're told that she seems to unite some of the best blessings of existence. As we move to the end of the sentence, however, that word seemed should have jumped out at us. It introduces an element of doubt. Does she or doesn't she unite those blessings? If not, then what could she possibly be lacking? Later paragraphs begin to suggest an answer while also sharpening our sense of Austen's heroine. Let's pick up the passage again. She was the youngest of the two daughters of a most affectionate, indulgent father, and had, in consequence of her sister's marriage, been mistress of his house from a very early period. Her mother had died too long ago for her to have more than an indistinct remembrance of her caresses, and her place had been supplied by an excellent woman as governess who had fallen little short of a mother in affection. So, it appears as if Emma has been a little spoiled. Her father has indulged her and has in fact put her in charge of the entire household. By now she's used to being in charge, used to having her way. But what about that governess? How much direction or guidance has she been able to provide? We find out the answer to that one in the next paragraph. 16 years had Miss Taylor, that's the governess, been in Mr. Woodhouse's family, so ever since Emma was 5. Less as a governess than as a friend, very fond of both daughters, but particularly of Emma. We'll stop there, because that doesn't really sound good. The person who might have provided guidance or direction has instead treated the girls as her friends. This is not a disaster. We know that Emma has a happy disposition and can assume that she hasn't seriously abused her power, but it's not a trifle either. The narrator closes this opening by adding some information about Emma's relationship to her governess and summing up, more explicitly than before, the real evils of Emma's situation. Here's how she does it. Between them, the narrator says, it was more the intimacy of sisters. Even before Miss Taylor had ceased to hold the nominal office of governess, the mildness of her temper had hardly allowed her to impose any restraint, and the shadow of authority being now long passed away, they had been living together as friend and friend, very mutually attached, and Emma doing just what she liked, highly esteeming Miss Taylor's judgment, but directed chiefly by her own. The real evils indeed of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much her own way and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. These were the disadvantages which threatened alloy to her many enjoyments. The danger, however, was at present so unperceived that they did not, by any means, rank as misfortunes with her. As the next few chapters play out, the evils and dangers of Emma's situation do indeed come into sharper focus. We see that Emma's judgment is clouded by vanity and self-delusion. She fancies herself a matchmaker, and in trying to pair up her friends and neighbors, she nearly spoils her own chance at happiness. By the end, those clouds have parted. Emma sees the light and learns the truth about herself and her world. She ends the novel married to Mr. Knightley, the wealthiest and most admirable man in her neighborhood. So Austen gives us another classic comedic ending. Interestingly, we not only observe this transformation, but also experience it. We share in it, since almost everything in the novel is presented to us from Emma's point of view, from Emma's perspective. By choosing this limited point of view, Austen sets a kind of trap for her readers. If we don't ask questions, if we don't read very carefully, we're likely to repeat many of Emma's mistakes, misinterpreting and misunderstanding the other characters just as she does. When those mistakes are exposed, we must also share Emma's bewilderment and perhaps her humiliation. That's not a bad thing, because it keeps us from feeling superior to Emma. And this is one of the interesting things about satire, I've always thought. If the satirist simply convinces you that other people are foolish, then he or she actually reinforces in you a sense of superiority. And that can often defeat the satirical purpose. That can often leave you feeling, a little better, a little more smug maybe, than you really deserve to feel. In the end of Austen's novel, we develop genuine sympathy for Emma, or we ought to, because we've been reminded of how easy it is to be wrong about other people. Austen's experiments with point of view are part of her larger attempt to create a vivid image of the mind in action. In many of the novel's most important scenes, Emma wrestles with conflicting emotions. As she gathers new impressions and takes in more information, she is often forced to reconsider her judgments, sometimes revising them, sometimes not. The result is not a summary of Emma's mental deliberations, but an exciting dramatization of them. Not a summary, but a dramatization. Austen's achievements become more obvious when we contrast her work with that of other novelists. As we consider these contrasts, we might remember that Austen was a devoted and passionate reader of fiction. By the time she began to do her first serious writing, in the 1790s, the novel was already a well-established form. Indeed, Austen has been rightly described as the first great novelist whose reading consisted largely of earlier novels. Austen came from a family of voracious readers, and she was encouraged to discuss contemporary fiction with her parents and her siblings. In the Austen household, as in many others, reading aloud was among the most popular pastimes. As she participated in these group readings, Austen had a chance to see how an audience might react to various fictional characters and situations. Interestingly, Austen's reading was not limited to the classics. She devoured almost everything, including works that other readers might have regarded as somewhat disreputable. And if I might step out and offer a little bit of advice to aspiring writers, that is a little more advice to those people, it would be to read as widely as you can. You can sometimes learn as much from a flawed or even a botched story as you can from a really great one. Well, what then did Austen learn from her predecessors? Well, from Samuel Richardson, Austen seems to have learned the importance of creating a strong bond between her characters and her readers. Richardson creates these bonds in a very simple way, by presenting the story through the characters' letters and journals. Only very, very rarely does a third-person narrator intrude upon one of Richardson's stories. To remind ourselves of how this technique can work, let's consider a representative passage from Pamela. In this passage, Pamela responds to an upsetting piece of news about Mr. B, her master and would-be seducer. He's been away on a hunting trip, and he seems to have run into trouble. As we move through the passage, please consider the fact that Pamela is something of a mystery to herself. She can't understand, much less control, her own feelings. Just now we heard that Mr. B had liked to have been drowned in crossing a stream a few days ago in pursuing his game. What is the matter with all his ill usage of me that I cannot hate him? To be sure, I am not like other people. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Let's leave the quote behind for a moment and just talk about what we've heard. The passage begins by creating a sense of immediacy. Just now we heard. And it goes on to express a feeling of alienation. I must be very different from other people. As it moves forward, this passage will remind us that what we see of Pamela is not what others see. We have access to her most private thoughts and feelings, while the rest of the characters are forced to rely on her outward behavior. Let's go back to the quotation. I am sure, Pamela says, I am sure he has done enough to make me hate him. But yet when I heard his danger, which was very great, I could not in my heart forbear rejoicing his safety, though his death would have ended my afflictions. Ungenerous master, if you knew this, you surely would not be so much my persecutor. But for my good lady's sake, I must wish him well, and oh, what an angel would he be in my eyes yet, if he would cease his attempts and reform. Now here Pamela really gives herself away, catching herself in the act of confessing her love for Mr. B. This is not something that she's wanted to do, and yet here she is, she's doing it anyway. Austen was intrigued by Richardson's work and borrowed his epistolary format for her initial experiments with fiction. She would have seen many other examples of epistolary fiction, by the way. Frances Burney's Evelina, one of her very favorite novels, is also told in letters. Austen employed the epistolary form in early drafts of Pride and Prejudice when she was still planning to use the title First Impressions, pretty good title, and she made room for one especially important letter from Mr. Darcy to Lizzie following his initial proposal in the final version of the novel. Although she admired and imitated Richardson, Austen seems to have wanted to avoid the emotional volatility of his characters, viewing it almost as a threat to her own control of the story. In Fielding, she found an interesting, if imperfect, alternative to Richardson. Fielding not only creates plots of great complexity, but also emphasizes the role of the narrator in guiding us through those stories. For this reason, Fielding never loses control of his stories, his characters, or his readers. For the same reasons, however, he never really succeeds in creating a strong emotional bond between the characters and the reader. To support this claim, let's consider an example from Tom Jones. Here, Fielding's narrator describes the emotional distress of his heroine, Sophia Western. At this point in the story, I need to explain, Sophie's father, whom she adores, insists that she marry Mr. Blifil, whom she despises. Her true love is, of course, Tom, but since he is still thought to be an orphan with no fortune or family connections, her father refuses to let them get together. As we move through this passage, please note the differences between Fielding and Richardson. Sophie's feelings are as intense as Pamela's, yet because those feelings are summarized by the narrator, not reported directly, we seem to view them from a distance. Sophia had lately been so distracted. That's how it starts. Sophia had been lately so distracted between hope and fear, her duty and love to her father, her hatred to Blifil, her compassion, and, why should we not confess the truth, her love for Jones, which last the behavior of her father, of her aunt, of everyone else, and more particularly of Jones himself, had blown into a flame, that her mind was in that confused state which may be truly said to make us ignorant of what we do or whither we go, or rather, indeed, indifferent as to the consequence of either. In this passage, the narrator uses words like us and we, pronouns are always important, to suggest the universality or familiarity of Sophia's feelings. Like Sophia, the narrator suggests, we've all been in that confused state which may be truly said to make us ignorant of what we do or whither we go. Yet despite the presence of these words, there's no denying that Fielding's main aim is not to create a vivid sense of emotional intimacy with Sophia. He seems, in fact, to have mistrusted, such effects, and he scrupulously avoids them in Tom Jones. We might observe, before moving on, that there's something almost platonic about Fielding's view of art. He wants to entertain, indeed to amuse, as well as to instruct, but he never seeks to stir or arouse the emotions. Austen builds on the achievements of writers like Richardson and Fielding, developing and refining her own way, a new way of representing human consciousness. More specifically, as Ian Watt explained in The Rise of the Novel, his classic study of early English fiction, Austen learns how to combine the emotional immediacy of Richardson with the narrative control of Fielding. Now, how does she manage that feat? It sounds like a difficult thing to attempt. Well, by developing a technique that allows her to blend or merge the voice of her narrator with that of her heroine. This technique allows the narrator to remain on the scene as a more or less reliable source of information without crowding Emma out of the picture. To consider this achievement in greater detail, let's turn our attention to the second half of the book, and in particular to the passage in which Emma realizes and confronts her true feelings for Mr. Knightley. In setting up this quotation, I'll need to explain that Emma spends much of the story trying to find a husband for her friend, Harriet Smith. Harriet is an orphan, but Emma is convinced, on the basis of no real evidence, that her family connections must be good, if not indeed aristocratic. She turns out to be wrong about that, by the way. Emma first tries to pair Harriet with Mr. Elton, a local clergyman, who actually ends up falling for Emma instead. Undeterred by this failure, Emma tries again, this time attempting to pair Harriet with a young man named Frank Churchill. It's worth noting that although Emma has always insisted on remaining single, she has also considered the possibility, just briefly, of getting together with Frank, only to conclude that he's a much better match for Harriet. Now, the problem is that Harriet doesn't see it that way. She disagrees. And in the conversation that precedes our crucial passage, she confesses her growing affection for none other than Mr. Knightley. This comes as a terrible shock to Emma, and over the course of several pages, she struggles to understand why. Here's how the quotation begins. The rest of the day, the following night, were hardly enough for her thoughts. She was bewildered amidst the confusion of all that had rushed on her within the last few hours. Every moment had brought a fresh surprise, and every surprise must be matter of humiliation to her. How to understand it all? How to understand the deceptions she had been thus practicing on herself and living under? The blunders, the blindness of her own head and heart. Let's stop there and think about this paragraph for a moment, and as we do, we should notice the ways in which Austen moves so gracefully and smoothly from outside to inside. The first sentences are not unlike those in Fielding, reporting and also describing Emma's feelings. She was bewildered amidst the confusion of all that had rushed on her. The following sentences are more like those in Richardson, in that they appear to come from Emma herself. How to understand it all, how to understand the deceptions she had been thus practicing on herself and living under. It is Emma, not the narrator, who offers those very harsh final judgments, the blunders, the blindness of her own head and heart. That transition from outside to inside, from summary and external description to what almost feels like a direct transcript of Emma's thought process, is characteristic of Jane Austen's mature art. It also represents an enormous advance in narrative technique. No one had ever done this sort of thing before, and few would ever again do it as well. Now here's how Austen develops the rest of this fascinating passage. She sat still, the narrator says. She walked about. She tried her own room. She tried the shrubbery. In every place, every posture, she perceived that she had acted most weakly. And now we're kind of back into what we might call Emma speak. Weakly seems to be her word, not the narrator's. That she had been imposed on by others in a most mortifying degree. That she had been imposing on herself in a degree yet more mortifying. That she was wretched, and should probably find this day but the beginning of wretchedness. At this point, Emma has no idea what to do, and in the next paragraph we see her slow down and take stock of her feelings, as if she's decided, sensibly, that she can't choose a course of action without first reckoning with her own desires. To understand, the narrator says, to understand, thoroughly understand her own heart was the first endeavor. To that point when every leisure moment which her father's claims on her allowed, and every moment of involuntary absence of mind. How long had Mr. Knightley been so dear to her, as every feeling declared him now to be? When had his influence, such influence, begun? When had he succeeded to that place in her affection which Frank Churchill had once, for a short period, occupied? Here, Emma questions and indeed challenges herself, attempting to reconstruct the past. When did Mr. Knightley's influence begin? How long has it lasted? Has Knightley only recently taken Frank's place? Or has he actually occupied that position all along? In the next few sentences, the questioning ceases, but the self-examination does not. She looked back, the narrator says. She compared the two, that is, Frank and Mr. Knightley, compared them as they had always stood in her estimation from the time of the latter's becoming known to her, and as they must at any time have been compared by her, had it by any blessed felicity occurred to her to institute the comparison. And we'll stop there. Now at the end of the passage, I hope you'll notice, Emma cuts herself off, revising her original thought to include the phrase, by any blessed felicity. Having done all this, she's ready to face the truth. Here's the quotation. She saw that there had never been a time when she did not consider Mr. Knightley as infinitely the superior, or when his regard for her had not been infinitely the most dear. She saw that in persuading herself, in fancying, in acting to the contrary, she had been entirely under a delusion, totally ignorant of her own heart, and in short, that she had never really cared for Frank Churchill at all. Okay, in this passage, we're given a vivid image of human consciousness in action. We see that our minds not only think and feel, but also reflect on their own operations. We see that to have a mind is to wonder why and how the mind can work as it does. With such passages, though she could not have realized it at the time, Austen was setting the stage for generations of later writers. The technique she developed is now called free indirect discourse, or free indirect speech, and to clarify the meaning of that term, I'll ask you to consider 3 sentences, all of which convey the same information. And I'll have to read out some of the punctuation to you, not exactly Victor Borge style, but still, so that you get some sense of how the sentences are different. Okay, here's the first one. Emma asked herself, comma, quotation, how long had Mr. Knightley been so dear to her? Question mark, close quote. This sentence is an example of direct discourse. It employs quotation marks as well as a tag identifying Emma as the speaker or thinker. Here's the next sentence. Emma asked herself how long Mr. Knightley had been so dear to her. This is an example of indirect discourse. This time, the quotation marks are gone and the original question is turned into a statement. Notice, though, that the tag, Emma asked herself, remains intact. Here then is the third sentence, the example of free indirect discourse, and the sentence that Austen actually wrote. How long had Mr. Knightley been so dear to her? Question mark. Now this time, both the quotation marks and the tag have disappeared completely, and the result is a heightened sense of immediacy. In this sentence, we almost seem to be listening in on Emma's thoughts, getting a direct and unmediated account of what's going on in her head. Austen uses all 3 methods, direct, indirect, and free indirect discourse, in writing a novel like Emma. Yet her real innovation, as I've already tried to suggest, lies in her use of free indirect discourse. Austen's technique was adopted and developed by later writers, including George Eliot and Henry James, and would in the 20th century serve as the basis for later forms of interior monologue and stream of consciousness narration. So when you're thinking about the great 20th century writers, when you're thinking about Virginia Woolf or James Joyce, or in an American context, William Faulkner, please don't forget that it all starts, really and truly starts, with this very obscure person living in a parsonage, writing on her own, surrounded only by the members of her family. It's an amazing, amazing fact that this is true, and yet it is a fact. And for that reason, more than any other, Austen remains not only beloved, but respected as one of the most important figures in the development of the English novel tradition. In our next lecture, we'll move on to the great novelists of the Victorian Age. The Victorian Age begins when Victoria takes the throne in 1837, and it ends when she dies in 1901. And we'll begin our study of the Victorian novel with the greatest of all Victorian writers, Charles Dickens.